The clock above my teller window showed 3:27 on that Friday afternoon when my life changed forever. The afternoon rush was in full swing at First National Bank. Customers lined up 6 deep babies, crying, everyone wanting to cash their paychecks before the weekend. That's when Derek Sullivan decided to humiliate me one last time. "Count that cash faster, honey." He sneered loud enough for everyone to hear his voice dripping with condescension as he stood behind me like some kind of overseer. I stopped counting the 20s in my hands and looked directly into his smug face. "I quit," I said calmly. His expression shifted from arrogance to panic. "You can't quit, it's payday," he stammered. I smiled for the first time in months. "I can," I replied, "because I own the building lease, and I'm closing the branch for renovation. Right now." The color drained from Derek's face, as if someone had pulled a plug. The customers in line stopped their chattering and turned to stare, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Mrs. Henderson, a regular customer who'd been coming here for 20 years, actually dropped her deposit slip. Derek tried to laugh it off, his voice cracking slightly. "Very funny, Britney. Everyone knows bank tellers don't own commercial real estate. Now get back to work before I write you up for insubordination." But I was already shutting down my cash drawer following the procedures I'd done hundreds of times before. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced to the line of customers, "I apologize for the inconvenience, but this branch will be closing temporarily for renovations starting immediately. You can visit our location on Maple Street, just 2 miles north." The other employees had stopped pretending to work. Jessica, the young college student Derek tormented daily, was staring with her mouth open. Carol, the divorced mother he'd been threatening with hour cuts, had tears in her eyes. Even Marcus, our security guard, was watching with fascination. You see, 3 years ago, I inherited this building from my great-aunt Eleanor. Most people didn't know much about Aunt Eleanor, but she was a force of nature back in her day. In 1972, when women could barely get business loans without a male co-signer, Eleanor bought this property and turned the ground floor into a successful restaurant. She fought tooth and nail against every man who tried to intimidate her, undercut her prices, or force her out of business. When Eleanor passed away, she left me everything. The building, the rental income from the 2 upstairs apartments, and most importantly, her journals filled with business wisdom and stories of standing up to bullies. The monthly rent from all 3 units totaled $6,800. Derek's precious bank branch paid $4,200 of that, but I'd kept my inheritance secret. I wanted to live a normal life, work an honest job, and stay connected to regular people. I never imagined I'd need to use this power to protect myself from a workplace predator. For 15 months, Derek had made my life miserable. He transferred here from corporate headquarters after what they called performance issues, though nobody explained what that meant. From his first day, he singled out the female employees for special treatment. Not the good kind. Jessica bore the worst of it. She was just 19, working part-time to pay for college, and Derek seemed to take pleasure in reducing her to tears. He'd criticize her appearance, make inappropriate comments about her clothing, and threaten her scholarship job if she didn't meet impossible sales quotas. Carol had it almost as bad. As a single mother, she desperately needed the income and health insurance. Derek knew this and used it against her, constantly threatening to cut her hours or change her schedule to conflict with her custody arrangements. Then there was Angela, a 58-year-old woman who'd worked at this branch for 12 years before Derek arrived. He made her life so miserable with age-related comments and impossible demands that she took early retirement, losing thousands in pension benefits. Derek's harassment wasn't random or emotional. It was calculated, systematic, and cruel. He studied our personnel files, learned our vulnerabilities, and used them as weapons. He knew Jessica needed her job for college. He knew Carol couldn't afford to lose her benefits. He knew Angela was close to retirement and could be pushed out. As I continued shutting down my station, Derek's panic intensified. "You can't just close a bank branch. There are regulations. Corporate approval required. You're having some kind of breakdown." That's when I pulled out my phone and started making calls. "Hello, Thompson Property Management. This is Britney Matthews. I need you to send someone over to First National Bank immediately to post notices about the temporary closure for renovations. Yes, I'm the owner. That's right, Eleanor Matthews was my great-aunt." Derek's face went from pale to green. He grabbed for my phone, but Marcus stepped between us. "Sir, I don't think you want to do that with all these witnesses around. The customers were murmuring among themselves, some pulling out their phones to record what was happening. I heard one woman whisper to her husband, "Did she just say she owns this place? The bank teller owns the building." That's when the front door chimed and Regional Supervisor Janet Powell walked in for her quarterly inspection. She took one look at the chaos, the shut-down teller window, the crowd of confused customers, and Derek's panicked expression, and I knew everything was about to change. Janet Powell was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd worked her way up through the banking industry the hard way. She surveyed the scene with sharp eyes, noting every detail: my closed teller window, Derek's sweaty desperation, the customers holding up phones, and the general atmosphere of barely contained chaos. "What exactly is going on here?" she asked in a voice that could cut glass. Derek immediately launched into damage control mode, his voice taking on the fake professional tone he used whenever corporate was around. "Janet, great to see you. We're just having a minor staffing issue. Britney here is having some kind of personal crisis and making wild claims about owning the building. I was just about to call for medical assistance, but I was ready for this. Over the past year, I'd documented everything. Every cruel comment, every impossible demand, every public humiliation. I'd legally recorded conversations in our state where only one party needs to consent. I'd saved emails, taken time-stamped photos of Derek's handwritten notes criticizing employees, and collected witness statements. Janet," I said calmly, "I'd like to file a formal complaint against Derek for workplace harassment. And I'm also serving notice that this branch's lease will be terminated due to hostile work environment violations." I handed her a folder I'd prepared months ago, hoping I'd never need to use it. Inside were copies of everything: the harassment documentation, my inheritance papers, the building's legal ownership documents, and the current lease agreement between my property management company and First National Bank. Janet's eyebrows rose as she flipped through the papers. "Let's take this to the conference room, now." The next hour was a revelation. In the privacy of the small conference room, Janet interviewed each of us separately, while corporate security joined by phone. When it was my turn, I presented my evidence methodically. This started on Derek's second day. I explained, showing her a photo of a note Derek had left on my desk. It read, "Teller speed unacceptable. Improve attitude and appearance. Final warning." I hadn't received any prior warnings, and this was about my appearance, not my performance. The recordings were even more damning. Derek's voice came through clearly as I played clips on my phone. "Listen, honey, this isn't a charity. If you can't handle the pressure, maybe you should find a job more suited to your limitations. Carol, if you can't work weekends, I'm sure there are plenty of desperate mothers who can. Jessica, that outfit is inappropriate for a professional environment. Are you trying to distract the male customers?" Janet's face grew darker with each piece of evidence. "How long has this been going on?" 15 months, since the day he arrived. When Janet interviewed Jessica, the young woman broke down completely. Through tears, she described Derek's daily torment, comments about her body threats, about her job security, and the impossible sales quotas he'd set just for her. "He knows I need this job for college," Jessica whispered. "My scholarship covers tuition, but I need this paycheck for rent and food. He told me that if I couldn't meet the quotas, maybe I should consider other ways to earn money. When I asked what he meant, he just smiled and said I was a smart girl and would figure it out." Carol's testimony was equally heartbreaking. Derek had systematically manipulated her schedule to interfere with her custody arrangements, knowing she couldn't afford a lawyer to fight back. "He'd wait until Friday afternoon to tell me I had to work Saturday morning, knowing that's when I pick up my kids," Carol explained. "When I said I couldn't do it, he'd act like I was being unreasonable and threatened to find someone more dedicated to the job." Even Marcus, our security guard, had stories about Derek's behavior. He'd ask me to keep extra close watch on the female employees, said they were security risks because they got emotional and might make mistakes with the money. But he never asked me to watch the male tellers the same way. Janet was taking detailed notes, her expression grim. When she called Derek in for his interview, his demeanor had completely changed. Gone was the confident bully I knew. Instead, he was nervous, defensive, and increasingly agitated. "These are all lies," Derek insisted. "Britney is obviously mentally unstable, and she's influenced the other employees against me. This is a conspiracy to damage my reputation and career." "What about the recordings?" Janet asked. Taken out of context, I was providing necessary performance feedback. If these employees can't handle professional criticism, they shouldn't work in banking. "And the building ownership?" Derek's pause was telling. I wasn't aware of any employee property ownership. That seems like a conflict of interest that should have been disclosed. But Janet had already verified everything with corporate legal. My inheritance was completely legitimate, and there was no requirement for employees to disclose property ownership unless it created a business conflict. In fact, the bank was my tenant, not the other way around. That's when the real bombshell dropped. Janet's phone rang and she stepped outside to take the call. When she returned, her face was ashen. "Derek," she said quietly. "That was corporate security. They've been reviewing your personnel file from your previous positions. Would you like to explain why there have been harassment complaints filed against you at 3 different branches over the past 5 years?" Derek's confident facade crumbled completely. Those were all resolved false accusations from disgruntled employees I was cleared each time. "Cleared or transferred to avoid lawsuits?" Janet asked pointedly. The truth was even worse than I'd imagined. Derek had a pattern spanning multiple states and branches. Wherever he went, female employees filed complaints, and corporate's solution was always the same: transfer him, quietly seal the records, and hope the problems went away. But Janet wasn't done. "There's something else, Derek. Building security called. They've been reviewing footage from the past several weeks due to some break-in concerns. Would you like to explain why you were accessing this building after hours using copied keys and searching through tenant files in the basement storage area?" Derek's face went dead white. In that moment, I realized this was bigger than workplace harassment. This was something far more sinister. The room fell silent as Derek's last defense crumbled. Janet had caught him in criminal activity, and we all knew it. But Derek's reaction surprised me. Instead of denying it or trying to explain, he became angry and desperate. "You have no idea what you're messing with," he said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "I have connections, important people who won't appreciate this kind of disruption to their business operations." That's when Detective Maria Santos arrived. Janet had called the police after the security footage revelation, and Detective Santos specialized in white-collar crimes. She was a compact woman with intelligent eyes and the kind of presence that made everyone sit up straighter. "Mr. Sullivan," Detective Santos said after Janet explained the situation, "I need to ask you some questions about your after-hours access to this building." Derek immediately clammed up and demanded a lawyer, but the damage was done. As Detective Santos reviewed the security footage on Janet's laptop, a disturbing pattern emerged. Over the past 6 weeks, Derek had entered the building 12 times after midnight. He'd used copied keys to access areas he had no business being in, particularly the basement storage, where tenant files and building maintenance records were kept. He'd photographed documents, made copies, and even attempted to access the building's main electrical panel. But that was just the beginning. Detective Santos made some calls, and within an hour we learned the scope of Derek's activities. His pattern of targeting female employees wasn't random harassment. It was a carefully orchestrated scheme to identify and exploit property-owning women. "We've been tracking a fraud network that specializes in forcing distressed property sales," Detective Santos explained. "The pattern is always the same target: a woman who owns commercial property, create workplace harassment to destabilize her emotionally and financially, then manufacture building problems that require expensive emergency repairs." Derek's brother-in-law, Tommy Sullivan, operated a construction company that specialized in emergency building repairs. The business model was simple but effective: create problems, offer solutions at inflated prices, and if the property owner couldn't pay, offer to buy the building at below market rates to help them out of a tough situation. The detective showed us examples from Derek's previous locations. In Ohio, a woman named Patricia owned a small office building where Derek managed a credit union branch. After months of workplace harassment that destroyed her emotional stability, mysterious electrical problems suddenly appeared that required $50,000 in emergency repairs. When Patricia couldn't afford it, Tommy's company offered to buy the building for $200,000 less than its actual value. In Tennessee, the pattern repeated with a woman named Linda who owned a strip mall. Derek's harassment campaign was followed by discovered foundation problems that would cost $80,000 to fix. Linda sold to Derek's associates for $300,000 below market value. "The harassment serves multiple purposes," Detective Santos explained. "It destabilizes the victim emotionally, making them more susceptible to pressure. It creates financial stress if they lose their job or take time off for mental health. And it provides cover for accessing building information during workplace conflicts." My case was different because I'd kept my ownership secret and had the financial resources to fight back. But Derek had still been gathering information, planning his attack. The basement files he'd accessed contained utility records, maintenance schedules, and structural reports that could be used to fabricate building problems. Detective Santos also revealed something even more disturbing. Derek hadn't just been harassing current employees. He'd been researching prospective targets, identifying women who owned commercial properties in the region, and then maneuvering to get assigned to branches in their buildings. He specifically requested the transfer to this location after learning about Eleanor Matthews' death and the property inheritance, Detective Santos said. Corporate records show he cited growth opportunities as his reason for wanting this assignment. The investigation expanded rapidly. Derek's phone records showed frequent communication with Tommy's construction company building inspectors in multiple cities and what appeared to be a network of associates involved in the property fraud scheme. Meanwhile, Derek's behavior became increasingly erratic. From his holding cell, he was making phone calls to unknown associates, apparently trying to coordinate some kind of damage control. Detective Santos was monitoring these calls, and what she heard made her decide to expand the investigation to federal level. "He's talking about cleaning up loose ends and making sure certain records disappear," she told Janet and me. "This isn't just local fraud. We're looking at interstate conspiracy and possibly federal banking violations." That's when everything clicked for me. I remembered the stories from Eleanor's journal about harassment she'd faced in the 70s from men trying to force her out of business. The tactics were remarkably similar: public humiliation, financial pressure, mysterious building problems that appeared right before purchase offers from their associates. I went home that evening and reread Eleanor's journals with new understanding. She'd documented everything just as I had. But more importantly, she'd written about fighting back against men who tried to use intimidation and fraud to steal women's property. One entry from 1975 stood out. "The Patterson boy came around again today with his father claiming my restaurant's electrical work isn't up to code. Funny how these problems always appear right after their construction company offers to buy me out. I told them if they set foot on my property again, I'll call the police. Some men think women are easy targets, but they picked the wrong one this time." Patterson. Derek's middle name was Patterson, according to his employee file. I called Detective Santos immediately. The next morning brought the bombshell that changed everything. Detective Santos arrived with FBI agents and a warrant for Derek's arrest on federal charges. The investigation had uncovered a multi-generational criminal enterprise spanning 7 states and involving dozens of victims. Derek's father, James Patterson Sullivan, had run the same property fraud scheme in the 70s and 80s before being convicted and imprisoned. Derek had revived the family business with modern updates, using his position in financial institutions to access victim information and coordinate harassment campaigns with construction fraud. But there was one more twist that none of us saw coming. As the FBI agents arrested Derek's associates and seized records from Tommy's construction company, they discovered Eleanor's name on a target list from 1975. Derek's father had tried to force Eleanor out of business and steal her property. She'd fought back so effectively that she'd helped send him to prison. Derek hadn't just randomly targeted me. This was revenge delayed by 30 years, but still burning with the same criminal intent. Eleanor's great-niece was going to pay for the sins of her great-aunt, or so Derek thought. He was wrong. The FBI's involvement transformed everything overnight. What had started as a workplace harassment complaint had become a federal case involving conspiracy, wire fraud, extortion, and violations of federal banking regulations. Derek found himself facing not just local charges, but federal crimes that carried serious prison time. Special Agent Rachel Kim led the federal investigation, and she painted a picture of criminal activity that was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. Derek's harassment network had operated across 7 states, targeting female property owners with military precision. "The pattern is sophisticated," Agent Kim explained during a press conference that drew national attention. The subjects identify targets through financial institution employment records, then coordinate systematic workplace harassment with construction fraud to force distressed property sales. We estimate victim losses exceed $2 million over a 15-year period. The media explosion was immediate and intense. Local news stations picked up the story first, framing it as "Brave bank teller exposes multi-state fraud ring." But as details emerged about the multi-generational criminal conspiracy and Derek's federal charges, national business media took notice. Bank manager's property fraud scheme, unraveled by courageous employee, became a headline in major newspapers. Financial news networks covered the corporate accountability angle, questioning how banks could employ known harassers without proper background checks or victim protections. Social media amplified everything exponentially. Bank teller justice started trending as thousands of women shared their own workplace harassment experiences. Support messages poured in from across the country, along with stories from other victims of similar property fraud schemes. The attention was overwhelming, but also validating. For months, I'd felt isolated and powerless against Derek's systematic abuse. Now suddenly I had an army of supporters who understood exactly what I'd endured. But the media attention brought unexpected challenges too. Derek's defense attorney launched a public relations campaign, painting me as an unstable employee seeking attention and money through false accusations. Anonymous social media accounts started spreading rumors about my mental health and family background. Detective Santos warned me this was standard intimidation tactics. They're trying to discredit you before the trial. Document everything, don't respond to provocations, and remember that we have evidence on our side. The corporate fallout was swift and severe. First National Bank's stock price dropped 12% as investors worried about the federal investigation's scope. Corporate headquarters faced intense scrutiny about their hiring practices and harassment complaint procedures. CEO William Morrison held an emergency press conference to announce comprehensive policy reforms. We failed our employees and customers by not properly investigating Mr. Sullivan's background. Effective immediately, we're implementing new harassment prevention protocols and victim protection procedures. Janet Powell was promoted to lead the new harassment prevention task force across all branches. She called me personally to apologize and offer whatever support I needed during the federal trial. Britney, she said, what happened to you should never happen to any employee. We're going to make sure it never happens again. But the real validation came from Derek's previous victims. As media coverage spread, women from Ohio, Tennessee, Kentucky, and 3 other states came forward with identical stories. Patricia, the office building owner Derek had targeted, called me directly. I lost my building and almost lost my business, she told me through tears. I thought I was going crazy, that maybe I really was as incompetent as he said. Seeing your story on the news made me realize it wasn't my fault. He was a predator and you stopped him. Linda, the strip mall owner from Tennessee, organized a conference call with all the known victims. Hearing their stories was heartbreaking but also empowering. Each woman described the same pattern: professional harassment, escalating to personal attacks, mysterious building problems appearing at convenient times, and pressure to sell at below-market rates. The worst part wasn't losing the money, Linda said. It was how he made me doubt myself. I started thinking maybe I wasn't cut out for business. Maybe I was too emotional or weak. It took years of therapy to realize he was deliberately destroying my confidence. That's when I understood the true scope of Derek's crimes. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about systematically destroying women's confidence, independence, and economic power. Derek and his associates were targeting the very foundation of women's financial freedom. The federal investigation continued expanding. Tommy Sullivan's construction company was raided, revealing contracts and correspondence that implicated building inspectors, city officials, and other financial institution employees across multiple states. What had seemed like isolated incidents were actually coordinated attacks by a criminal network. But Derek's arrest had unintended consequences too. Other harassment victims at banks and credit unions across the region started coming forward, recognizing similar patterns in their own experiences. The FBI established a victim hotline that received over 300 calls in the first week. Agent Kim called to update me on the investigation's progress. Your courage in fighting back has opened the floodgates. We're discovering victims we never knew existed and patterns we never recognized. This case is going to change how we investigate workplace harassment and financial institution fraud. The community support was incredible. Local women's business organizations rallied around my story, organizing fundraisers for my legal expenses, even though they weren't necessary. The building's other tenants, Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the medical practice and attorney Sarah Brennan from the law firm upstairs, offered their professional services pro bono. Derek asked me suspicious questions about the building's electrical systems and emergency access, Dr. Walsh told investigators. At the time, I thought he was just being thorough about safety. Now I realize he was planning sabotage. Attorney Brennan had similar experiences. He wanted to know about lease termination clauses and building ownership transfers. He claimed it was for corporate planning purposes, but the questions were oddly specific and legally sophisticated. As the trial date approached, Derek's desperation intensified. From federal detention, he attempted to hire private investigators to find damaging information about me and other victims. He pressured former associates to recant their cooperation with authorities through intimidation tactics. Detective Santos kept me informed about these activities. He's trying everything to avoid conviction, but the evidence is overwhelming. What you need to focus on is your testimony and your recovery. Recovery was harder than I'd expected. Despite the support and media attention, I struggled with anxiety and hypervigilance. Simple things like going to work or answering my phone became sources of stress. Derek's harassment had left deeper psychological wounds than I'd realized. That's when I started therapy with Dr. Lisa Rodriguez, a specialist in workplace trauma and harassment recovery. She helped me understand that my emotional responses were normal and that healing would take time. What you experienced was psychological warfare designed to break your spirit, Dr. Rodriguez explained. The fact that you fought back and won doesn't erase the trauma. Recovery is a process, not a destination. Through therapy, I began to see my experience differently. Instead of feeling like a victim who got lucky, I started understanding myself as a survivor who fought back effectively. The distinction was important for my mental health and my preparation for the federal trial. But the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. Eleanor's elderly neighbor, Mrs. Catherine Flynn, who was 93 years old and sharp as a tack. She contacted me after seeing the media coverage and wanted to share stories about Eleanor's battles in the 70s. "Your great-aunt was a warrior," Mrs. Flynn told me over tea in her living room. "She faced the same kinds of men your Derek represents, but she never backed down. She'd say, 'Catherine, some people mistake kindness for weakness, but they learn better when we fight back.'" Mrs. Flynn had photographs and documents Eleanor had shared with her, including evidence about James Patterson Sullivan's attempts to force Eleanor out of business. She'd kept everything in a shoebox for 30 years, waiting for someone who might need it. Eleanor always said the fight wasn't over, that men like that would keep trying until someone stopped them permanently, Mrs. Flynn said. "She'd be proud of you for finishing what she started." As I prepared for trial, I realized this case had become bigger than my personal experience. Derek's conviction could set precedents for prosecuting workplace harassment, protect future victims, and dismantle a criminal network that had operated with impunity for decades. The stakes were high, but so was my determination. Eleanor had fought her battles with the tools available in the 70s. I had modern technology, federal law enforcement, and a community of supporters she could never have imagined. Derek had made one crucial mistake in his calculations. He'd assumed that because Eleanor was dead, her legacy of fighting back had died with her. But legacies don't die. They get inherited along with the buildings and the business wisdom and the unshakable conviction that predators must be stopped. The federal courthouse in downtown was packed as Derek's trial began 6 months later. Media attention had remained intense throughout the pretrial period, with legal experts calling it a landmark case for workplace harassment prosecution and financial institution accountability. Federal prosecutor Amanda Taylor opened with a devastating summary of the evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a predator who used his position of trust in financial institutions to systematically target, harass, and defraud hardworking women across 7 states. The defendant didn't just commit crimes, he perfected them." The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. Agent Kim presented evidence of Derek's coordination with his criminal network, recorded phone calls, planning harassment campaigns, financial records showing kickbacks from property sales and email correspondence, discussing target acquisition and pressure applications. But the most powerful evidence came from Eleanor's journals, which Mrs. Flynn had provided to investigators. Reading those entries aloud in court created an eerie connection between past and present. September 15th, 1975. I read from Eleanor's journal during my testimony. "The Patterson man came again today with his construction crew, claiming they found foundation problems that require immediate repair. Strange how these problems only appear after I refuse his son's offers to buy my restaurant. I documented everything with photographs and told him if he sets foot on my property again, I'll call the police. The jury was transfixed as I explained how Derek's father had used identical tactics against Eleanor 30 years earlier. The multi-generational criminal conspiracy wasn't just about money. It was about a family tradition of targeting independent women who dared to own property and operate businesses. Derek's defense attorney tried the character assassination strategy, portraying me as an unstable employee seeking revenge and publicity. But the evidence was too strong and the pattern too clear across multiple victims and states. Jessica's testimony was particularly powerful. She'd grown in confidence since Derek's arrest, earning her college degree and accepting a management trainee position at another bank. Her transformation from a terrorized teenager to a poised young professional illustrated the true cost of Derek's harassment. He didn't just make comments about my appearance, Jessica told the jury. He systematically destroyed my confidence and made me question my intelligence, my judgment, and my worth as a person. I started having panic attacks and failing my college classes because I believed what he said about me. Carol testified about the financial stress Derek's harassment had created, forcing her to choose between keeping her job and caring for her children. He knew exactly how to manipulate my desperation. Every threat about schedule changes or hour cuts was calculated to keep me compliant and silent. The evidence of Derek's property fraud network was equally damning. Patricia testified via video link about losing her Ohio office building, describing how Derek's harassment had made her so emotionally unstable that she'd agreed to a below-market sale just to escape the stress. "I lost $300,000 in property value because I thought I was having a mental breakdown," Patricia said. "Mr. Sullivan convinced me I was incompetent and unstable. It wasn't until I saw Britney's story that I realized it was all deliberate psychological manipulation." Tommy Sullivan. Derek's brother-in-law had already pleaded guilty to construction fraud charges and was cooperating with prosecutors. His testimony revealed the criminal network's structure and methods in devastating detail. Derek would identify targets through their employment records at banks and credit unions, Tommy explained. Women who owned commercial property but worked regular jobs were perfect targets because they didn't have the resources to fight back effectively. Derek would create the workplace pressure while my company manufactured the building problems. The financial evidence was staggering. Forensic accountants traced over $2 million in fraudulent property transfers, inflated construction contracts, and kickback payments across the criminal network. Derek had personally profited by over $400,000 from his 15-year harassment and fraud campaign. But the trial's most dramatic moment came when Derek took the stand in his own defense. Against his attorney's advice, he attempted to justify his actions and attack his victims' credibility. "These women are trying to destroy my career and reputation with false accusations," Derek insisted. "I provided necessary workplace feedback and professional guidance. If they couldn't handle the pressure of working in financial services, that's not my fault." Prosecutor Taylor's cross-examination was surgical. She presented Derek with his own recorded statements, his documented lies to investigators, and the overwhelming evidence of his coordination with the fraud network. "Mr. Sullivan, is it your testimony that 9 different women across 7 states all conspired to make identical false accusations against you? They're all emotionally unstable and vindictive," Derek replied, apparently unaware of how his words sounded to the jury. "And is it your testimony that your father's conviction for identical crimes in the 1980s was also the result of a conspiracy by emotionally unstable women?" Derek's composure finally cracked. "My father was railroaded by a biased system that protects women who can't compete in business honestly." The courtroom fell silent. In those words, Derek had revealed the misogynistic ideology driving his criminal behavior. He genuinely believed that women who owned property and operated businesses were threats to natural order that needed to be eliminated. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all federal charges: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, extortion, violation of federal banking regulations, and violation of civil rights under color of law. Derek's conviction was total and devastating. Judge Margaret Richardson didn't mince words during sentencing. "Mr. Sullivan, your crimes represent a systematic attack on women's economic independence and constitutional rights. Your network targeted victims specifically because they were women who dared to own property and operate businesses. This court will not tolerate such predatory behavior." Derek received 8 years in federal prison plus 5 years supervised probation. He was ordered to pay $700,000 in restitution to victims across multiple states and was permanently banned from employment in financial services. But the trial's impact extended far beyond Derek's personal conviction. Corporate executives from 3 different financial institutions faced individual charges for covering up harassment complaints and enabling Derek's criminal behavior through deliberate indifference. Federal banking regulations were updated to require harassment pattern tracking across institutions, preventing banks from simply transferring problem employees without disclosure. Corporate executive compensation became tied to harassment prevention metrics and employee safety outcomes. The case established legal precedents that strengthened prosecution of harassment-enabled financial crimes and corporate accountability for workplace predator protection. Law schools began using Derek's case as a textbook example of systematic harassment prosecution and victim empowerment. Most importantly for me personally, the trial provided complete vindication and closure. Every doubt Derek had planted about my competence, stability, and worth had been publicly refuted by overwhelming evidence and legal victory. As I left the courthouse after Derek's sentencing, I felt Eleanor's presence strongly. The building she'd fought to protect was now safe forever. The criminal network that had targeted her for 30 years was finally destroyed. And the legacy of fighting back that she'd passed to me was now inspiring other women across the country to stand up against workplace predators. Derek's systematic destruction was complete, but it was just the beginning of systematic change that would protect future generations of women from similar attacks. 1 year later, I stood in the completely renovated building that had started everything, but I was no longer the same person who'd once counted cash behind a teller window. The transformation was profound, both in the physical space and in my own life. The ground floor now housed 3 women-owned businesses: an accounting firm specializing in small business financial services, a graphic design studio focusing on nonprofit marketing, and a counseling practice that provided therapy for workplace harassment survivors. The space bustled with activity and positive energy that would have amazed Eleanor. My own transformation had been just as dramatic. What started as a desperate act of self-defense had evolved into a national advocacy career that provided both purpose and financial security beyond anything I'd imagined. The federal government hired me as a consultant for new workplace harassment prevention initiatives, developing training programs that were being implemented across multiple federal agencies. Congressional testimony became a regular part of my work. Just last month, I'd appeared before the House Financial Services Subcommittee on Consumer Protection, sharing my experience and recommendations for strengthening workplace protection laws. The legislation that resulted, dubbed the Eleanor Matthews Workplace Protection Act, was named after my great-aunt and her decades of fighting for women's economic rights. But the most meaningful work was the direct victim advocacy. The Eleanor Matthews Foundation, established with proceeds from my book deal and speaking fees, had helped 47 harassment survivors fight back against workplace predators in its first year. We provided legal support, financial assistance, and emotional counseling to women who couldn't afford to battle powerful institutions alone. Sarah, the attorney from upstairs who'd helped document evidence against Derek, became the foundation's legal director. She'd left her private practice to focus full-time on harassment cases, finding her true calling in victim advocacy. "Every case reminds me why this work matters," Sarah told me during our monthly foundation meeting. "These predators count on their victims being isolated and powerless. When we provide resources and support, the power dynamic completely shifts." The personal relationships I'd built through this experience had become the foundation of my new life. My engagement to David, which had grown from our shared passion for justice advocacy, represented a partnership between equals who supported each other's missions rather than traditional gender roles. David had left his private legal practice to become a federal prosecutor, specializing in workplace harassment cases. His success rate was remarkable, partly because he understood the psychological dynamics of these crimes from watching my recovery process. "Britney taught me that harassment isn't just about individual bad actors," David explained to a conference of prosecutors. "It's about systematic attacks on women's economic independence. When we prosecute these cases as economic crimes, we get much stronger convictions and longer sentences." My therapy with Dr. Rodriguez had evolved from trauma recovery to leadership development. The hypervigilance and anxiety that had plagued me after Derek's arrest had gradually transformed into heightened awareness and strategic thinking that served my advocacy work. Trauma can become a superpower when it's properly processed and channeled, Dr. Rodriguez observed during one of our sessions. Your experience gave you insights into predatory behavior patterns that most people never develop. You're using that knowledge to protect others. The Foundation's work had expanded beyond individual cases to systematic change initiatives. We'd partnered with women's business organizations across 12 states to create rapid response networks for harassment victims. When a woman reported workplace harassment, she was immediately connected with legal resources, financial support, and emotional counseling. Jessica had become one of our most effective advocates. Her transformation from Derek's victim to a confident leader was remarkable to witness. She'd completed her business degree with honors and was now pursuing a law degree with plans to specialize in employment discrimination. Mr. Sullivan taught me something valuable, even though he didn't mean to, Jessica told a conference of college women. He showed me that predators target women who seem vulnerable and isolated. But when we stand together and refuse to be intimidated, we become unstoppable. Carol had found her calling in human resources developing harassment prevention programs for companies across the region. Her firsthand experience with workplace manipulation made her uniquely qualified to identify predatory behavior patterns and design effective intervention strategies. I know what it feels like to be trapped and desperate, Carol said during a corporate training session. That's why I can recognize the warning signs when employees are being systematically targeted. Early intervention saves lives and careers. Even Marcus had found purpose in our advocacy network. He'd become a consultant for workplace security firms, training security personnel to recognize and document harassment behavior. His calm presence and detailed observation skills made him invaluable for evidence gathering. The ripple effects of Derek's conviction continued spreading throughout the financial services industry. Banks and credit unions had implemented new background check procedures that prevented known harassers from simply transferring between institutions. Employee protection protocols now included anonymous reporting systems and victim support resources. Federal banking regulators had established new oversight requirements that held corporate executives personally accountable for harassment prevention failures. The days of quietly transferring problem employees to avoid lawsuit liability were over. But perhaps the most satisfying change was what had happened to Derek himself. Federal prison had not been kind to him. Other inmates and staff were aware of his crimes against women, resulting in social isolation and frequent conflicts. His attempts to maintain his arrogant superiority had failed completely in an environment where actions had immediate consequences. Prison counselors reported that Derek was struggling with the required psychological treatment programs. He continued to blame his victims and deny responsibility for his actions, making genuine rehabilitation unlikely. His parole prospects were poor, given his refusal to demonstrate remorse or behavioral change. Tommy, his brother-in-law, had served his shorter sentence and been released, but their construction fraud network was permanently destroyed. Civil lawsuits from victims had bankrupted their company and left Tommy personally liable for hundreds of thousands in restitution payments. The broader criminal network had been completely dismantled. Building inspectors in 4 cities faced corruption charges, and several other financial institution employees had been convicted of conspiracy charges. The coordinated law enforcement response had effectively ended a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for decades. For me personally, the most healing aspect of the entire experience had been connecting with Eleanor's memory in a deeper way. Mrs. Flynn had become like a grandmother to me, sharing stories and wisdom from Eleanor's life that helped me understand my inheritance in broader terms. Your great-aunt always said the property wasn't the real inheritance, Mrs. Flynn told me on one of our regular afternoon visits. The real inheritance was the courage to fight back against people who try to steal women's dreams and independence. You've honored that legacy beautifully. The building itself had become a symbol of resistance and empowerment. Women's business groups held their meetings in our renovated conference room. College students studying business and social justice requested tours to understand how individual courage could create systematic change. Most importantly, the Foundation's work was preventing other women from experiencing what I'd endured. Our early intervention programs had helped over 200 women escape harassment situations before they escalated to criminal behavior. Employment lawyers reported using our documentation methods and legal strategies in cases across the country. The speaking engagements and media appearances that had once terrified me had become opportunities to share practical knowledge with audiences who needed it. Every conference, every interview, every training session was a chance to arm other women with the tools they needed to fight back effectively. As I prepared for my wedding to David, scheduled for next month in the building where everything began, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed. The shy, intimidated bank teller who'd once suffered Derek's abuse in silence had become a national advocate whose work was protecting thousands of women. But the person I was most grateful to was Eleanor. Without her legacy of courage, her documentation of similar battles, and her financial independence that became my inheritance, Derek's criminal network might still be operating. Her fight in the 70s had laid the foundation for my victory in the 21st century. The greatest gift Eleanor had given me wasn't property ownership or rental income. It was the understanding that individual courage could dismantle systematic oppression, that one person's refusal to stay silent could protect countless others from similar attacks. Derek had made one fatal error in his criminal calculations. He'd assumed that Eleanor's death meant the end of resistance to his family's predatory behavior. But Eleanor's legacy didn't die with her. It had been inherited, strengthened, and transformed into a movement that would protect future generations of women from workplace predators. Standing in the building where Eleanor had fought her battles and where I'd fought mine, I understood that our individual victories were part of something much larger: the long struggle for women's economic independence and the right to work without fear. The fight wasn't over, but the tools for victory were now available to anyone brave enough to use them. 2 years had passed since that Friday afternoon when I'd stunned Derek with my revelation about owning the building lease, but it felt like a lifetime of growth and transformation. As I sat in my office on the 3rd floor, the one Eleanor had designed as her private retreat, I marveled at how completely my world had changed. The building hummed with purpose and positive energy. Downstairs, Maria's accounting firm was helping 3 new women-owned businesses organize their finances. The graphic design studio was creating a campaign for a nonprofit that provided job training to domestic violence survivors. The counseling practice had expanded to include group therapy sessions for workplace harassment survivors from across the region. My work with the Eleanor Matthews Foundation had grown beyond anything I'd imagined possible. We'd helped 137 women fight back against workplace harassment in 18 states. More importantly, our legal victories had created precedents that made it easier for future victims to seek justice and harder for predators to escape consequences. The federal consulting work had evolved into a permanent position as Director of Workplace Protection Innovation for the Department of Labor. My team was developing new protocols for investigating harassment complaints that crossed state lines and involved financial institutions. The work was challenging and fulfilling in ways I'd never experienced during my banking career, but the personal transformation ran deeper than professional success. The hypervigilance and anxiety that had once controlled my life had been replaced by confidence and strategic awareness. I could walk into any room and quickly assess power dynamics, identify potential predators, and recognize women who might be experiencing harassment. This skill had proven invaluable in my advocacy work. Just last week, I'd identified concerning behavior by a manager at a credit union in Oregon and helped connect his victim with resources before the situation escalated to criminal activity. Early intervention was becoming our specialty. My relationship with David had deepened into the kind of partnership Eleanor had dreamed of but never found in her era. We supported each other's work, shared domestic responsibilities equally, and made major decisions together based on our combined expertise and values. "You've taught me that true strength isn't about dominance," David told me on the morning of our 2nd wedding anniversary. "It's about using your power to lift others up and protect people who can't protect themselves." The foundation's impact was measurable and growing. Our scholarship program had sent 43 women to business school with specializations in property ownership and financial independence. The rapid response network we'd established could deploy legal and financial resources to harassment victims within 24 hours of their initial contact. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of our work was the transformation we saw in individual women. Jessica had graduated law school and passed the bar exam, specializing in employment discrimination cases. Her first major victory had been against a bank manager using tactics remarkably similar to Derek's. "Everything Mr. Sullivan did to try to destroy me actually made me stronger," Jessica said during her bar admission ceremony. He taught me to recognize predatory behavior, document evidence, and never accept abuse as normal. Those skills make me a better lawyer and a more effective advocate. Carol had earned a master's degree in human resources and was now a regional director for workplace safety at a major corporation. Her programs had been implemented across 8 states and were credited with preventing dozens of harassment situations from escalating. The most important thing I learned from our experience with Derek is that harassment thrives in isolation. Carol explained to a conference of HR professionals. When we create systems for victims to report safely and get immediate support, predators lose their power. Even Marcus had found his calling in our work. His security consulting firm specialized in workplace safety for small businesses with particular expertise in protecting female employees and business owners. His calm presence and detailed documentation skills had helped prosecute 12 harassment cases in the past year. The ripple effects continued spreading through multiple industries. Banking regulations now required annual harassment pattern audits and executive accountability for prevention failures. Credit unions had implemented new oversight procedures that prevented known predators from simply transferring between institutions. Corporate America had been forced to confront the reality that ignoring harassment was not only morally wrong, but financially devastating. The lawsuits, federal investigations, and regulatory penalties that followed Derek's conviction had cost his former employers millions of dollars and irreparable reputation damage. But the changes went beyond policy reforms. A cultural shift was occurring in how workplace harassment was understood and addressed. Victims were no longer expected to suffer in silence or accept abuse as the price of employment. Predators could no longer rely on institutional protection or victim isolation. Derek's own fate provided a cautionary tale about the consequences of systematic predatory behavior. He'd been denied parole twice due to his refusal to acknowledge his crimes or demonstrate genuine remorse. Prison counselors reported that he continued blaming his victims and plotting revenge against those who'd testified against him. Some people are so invested in their victim-blaming worldview that they can't change even when it destroys their lives, Dr. Rodriguez observed during one of our sessions. Derek represents the extreme end of misogynistic entitlement that sees women's independence as a personal threat. The federal investigation had revealed that Derek's harassment network had targeted over 300 women across 2 decades. The criminal enterprise had operated with such systematic efficiency that it had become a case study in federal law enforcement training programs. Tommy and the other co-conspirators had served their sentences, but remained financially devastated by restitution obligations and civil lawsuits. Their construction fraud network was permanently destroyed, and several associates faced ongoing state prosecution for related crimes. Most importantly for me personally, the trauma that had once defined my experience had transformed into wisdom and purpose. The hypervigilance that had made simple tasks like answering the phone feel threatening now served as a sophisticated early warning system for identifying predatory behavior. Trauma becomes a superpower when it's processed, integrated, and channeled toward protecting others. I explained to a group of psychology students, my experience with Derek taught me to recognize manipulation tactics, document evidence effectively, and never accept abuse as normal. The Foundation's educational programs had reached over 10,000 women through workshops, online training, and speaking engagements. We were teaching practical skills, how to document harassment, what legal resources were available, how to build support networks, and when to escalate to law enforcement. But beyond the practical knowledge, we were fostering a cultural change in how women understood their rights and power. The message was simple but revolutionary. You don't have to accept abuse. You deserve to be treated with respect. And you have more power than you realize when you're willing to fight back strategically. Eleanor's legacy had evolved from individual resistance to systematic change. Her journals were now published as a book about women's business history, inspiring a new generation of female entrepreneurs who understood that economic independence required vigilance and courage. The building itself had become a pilgrimage site for women facing similar challenges. They came to see where Eleanor had fought her battles and where I'd fought mine, drawing inspiration from the fact that ordinary people could defeat systematic oppression through courage and determination. Mrs. Flynn, now 95, and still sharp, had become the Foundation's honorary grandmother and unofficial historian. She regularly spoke to groups about Eleanor's era and the parallels with contemporary harassment battles. The tactics haven't changed much, Mrs. Flynn told a recent group of visitors. Predators still try to isolate women, destroy their confidence, and steal their economic power. But women today have tools and resources Eleanor could never have imagined. The key is using them before it's too late. As I prepared for another speaking engagement, this time at a national conference on workplace harassment prevention, I reflected on the profound lesson that had emerged from this entire experience. Individual courage could create systematic change, but only when it was supported by community, documented thoroughly, and channeled toward protecting others. Derek had made the mistake of assuming that women were isolated victims who would suffer in silence rather than fight back. He'd underestimated the power of documentation, community support, and strategic resistance. Most importantly, he'd failed to understand that his attacks on individual women were attacks on a larger community that would eventually unite to defend itself. The fight for workplace safety and women's economic independence would continue for generations to come. But the tools for victory were now available: legal precedents, federal oversight, community support networks, and most importantly, the understanding that predators could be defeated when their victims refused to remain silent. Eleanor's building had become more than a symbol of resistance. It was a launching pad for systematic change that would protect countless women from experiencing what I'd endured. The property she'd fought to protect in the 1970s was now generating resources to fight similar battles across the country. Standing in Eleanor's office, surrounded by her journals and photographs, I felt her presence and approval. The scared bank teller who'd once counted cash while enduring daily humiliation had become a national advocate whose work was dismantling the very systems that enabled workplace predators. The most important lesson had nothing to do with property ownership or legal strategies. It was about understanding that we all have more power than we realize, especially when we're willing to use it to protect not just ourselves, but others who face similar threats. Derek's systematic destruction had been complete, but it was really just the beginning of systematic protection for women in workplaces across America. Eleanor's legacy of fighting back had been inherited, multiplied, and transformed into a movement that would continue long after I was gone. Have you ever experienced workplace harassment or known someone who has? What steps do you think we should take to better protect employees from systematic abuse? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if it resonated with your own experiences. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about ordinary people fighting back against injustice, and share this story with anyone who might need to hear that they're not alone and they have more power than they realize. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people who never planned to be heroes but refuse to stay silent when faced with injustice. Your courage today could protect countless others tomorrow.